Peace be to you. I am of the opinion that the change of Qibla or direction of prayer of the Muslims to the Kaaba in Mecca, Saudi Arabia did not happen at the time of Muhammad. Nowhere in the entire book of the Quran, Allah said to Muhammad directly, "I'm Allah, prostrate before the Kaaba in Mecca, whenever you pray to me." The words Makka and Bakka are mentioned only once each in the entire book of the Quran, which was dated over 100 years after the death of Muhammad in 632 AD. In fact, Yahweh God Almighty has his precedent law for the word Allah means oak, not the God. In Joshua chapter 24 verse 26, it is written, "And Joshua wrote these words in the book of the Law of Elohim, and took a great stone, and set it up there under an Elah oak, that was by the sanctuary of Yahweh." Yahweh said to Moses, "I am Yahweh," for 71 times, and out of which 27 times Yahweh said, "I am Yahweh your God." The original blasphemy law of Yahweh in Deuteronomy chapter 18 verse 20 says, "But the prophet, which shall presume to speak a word in my name, which I have not commanded him to speak, or that shall speak in the name of other Elohim, even that prophet shall die." Yahweh cannot dishonor his own law, and took a Hebrew word Allah, to become his title apart from Elohim. Let's listen to Dr. J. Smith, a Christian apologist, who earned a second master's degree in Islamic studies from Fuller Theological Seminary and a Doctor of Philosophy at the London School of Theology. By invoking the United States Fair Use Law, I shall play the recorded video clip of his theory as to who actually created Islam, Quran and Muslims, since Allah actually remains an oak tree.
The Mosque of the Two Qiblas supposedly was facing Mecca, but it was returned, it moved to Mecca later. What was the earlier Qibla? When they uncovered it, they were refurbishing the mosque in 1987, and as they dug down, they came across the original Qibla. And look what they found. The original Qibla was not facing Mecca, it was facing the opposite direction, towards Petra, in Jordan. The great mosque in Guangzhou in China, built in 630, which is Guangzhou, I've been told. Sorry, I got it wrong. Did I still say it correct? Anybody correct me? I got hammered by a Chinese the other day for saying it wrong. Guangzhou, Zhao. It's now Canton today. In 630, take a look. It's 12 degrees off. So where is it facing? Not Jerusalem, not Mecca, but Petra. Look at the date, 630. The Fustat Mosque outside of Egypt, the one we've been referring to, built in 641. The description of the original floor plan showed a Qibla to the east, and then later turned towards the south. Dan Gibson found that that Qibla towards the east was Petra. Therefore, in 700 AD, it was still facing Petra. The Al-Aqsa Mosque, now take a look at this one. This is the Al-Aqsa Mosque that's right there in front of the Dome of the Rock. It's built in 706, built on a citadel. But when you look at the entire citadel, both of the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is here, and the Dome of the Rock, which is up there, when you look at the two of them, you will see that the entire citadel is facing one uniform direction. So both the Dome of the Rock, which is built in 691, and the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is built in 706, both of them are, in fact, all of the citadel is facing Petra. And it's still facing Petra today. It hasn't changed. This is what we think so far. To make sense of all what's going on, we need to begin with Abdul ibn Zubair. Abdullah ibn Zubair was the one that rebelled against the Umayyads. He didn't see them as legitimate rulers. He was the governor of Petra himself. When he rebelled in 683, during the beginning of the Marwanid period of what we know as the Umayyad Caliphate. You had the Sufyanis from 661 up until 680, then Marwan I takes over power, and then 683, Zubair rebels against him. He's there in Petra, and this is the beginning of what we know as the Second Civil War. Now what's curious and what's interesting is the Umayyads are not down in Medina, they're not down in Mecca, they're not in Jerusalem, they're not in Petra, they're way up in Damascus. What are they doing way up in Damascus? Why has no one questioned this? That's even another 450, 500 miles even further north. So if this is the center of Islam, why is it so far away? In fact, you're talking about almost 1,000 miles away from Mecca. It's obvious that people haven't asked these questions because these are damaging questions. And that's why we're asking them now. And you can then understand why Zubair, when he then rebels against the Umayyads, he's got to leave Petra. So what does he do? He destroys the Kaaba, and then he takes the black stone, which is in Petra. There is documentation that it's been there for many years. Wherever the black stone is where God's presence is. He takes the black stone, leaves Petra in 683, and flees down to the south. Where did he flee to? Looks like he fled to Mecca. The Abbasids, meanwhile, who are headquartered up in Kufa and in Baghdad, further to the east, they do not like the Umayyads. They have always had a problem with the Umayyads. They then come alongside Zubair. Zubair is then killed by the Umayyads, and so therefore, you have two different groups who now have two different Qiblas. One towards Mecca and the other towards Petra. Now, let's now go back to Abd al-Malik, because this is where it all comes and it gets fleshed out. Abd al-Malik is the Umayyad Caliph. He's already having problems with Zubair. He's killed Zubair, in fact. He's got to establish his ascendancy. So what does he do? In 691, he plants a huge building right in the middle of Jerusalem called the Dome of the Rock. You've seen it, those who've been to Jerusalem. It stands out. It's a beautiful building. You can see it from all over Jerusalem, with that beautiful golden dome. That's built in 691. He needs to create an identity. He needs to create his own Arab identity. Now remember, when the Arabs who then took over the Sassanid world and also the Byzantine world, which they had done by 642. They had run over Basra, Baghdad, Damascus, Jerusalem, and Cairo. They took over these 5 great cities of Levant. They were all nomadic. They were not urban people. That's why they did not live in those cities. They lived outside the cities in garrison towns. But someone had to run the cities. Well, who are they going to let run the cities? They're going to let their cousins from the Abrahamic race, the Jews and the Christians, who were well educated. They were already living in the cities. So they let them run the cities. They became what they call mawalas or mawalis. As long as they ran the cities, the Arabs then benefited from all the produce. They didn't have to run it themselves, and they could continue to conquer. And that's why they then moved right across North Africa, all the way to Spain, and moved the other direction to India. They were busy conquering, and they kept the Jews, primarily the Jews and the Christians, to run what they conquered. But the problem is this. The Jews and the Christian had a prophetic line. The Arabs don't have a prophetic line. The Jews and the Christians were the ones from which all the prophets came to. Therefore, they had a strong identity. Where was there an Arab prophet? So by the time, 40 years later, by the time Abd al-Malik comes to power, he is known as the Great Arab Reformer. We've known this about him. Everybody knows him as the Great Arab Reformer. He is the one that introduces Arabic as the international script. Now, up until that time, all the caliphs had used coins. They had coins that were like the dinar that you see here. Take a look at the dinar. That's the Byzantine dinar at the top. And when you notice, you'll see the emperor with 2 retainers on either side. On the back side of the dinar is the Byzantine cross. The Sufyanis, or the Umayyads, take the same coin because they still want to use the same type of coinage. And instead of using the emperor, they put themselves, the caliph, with 2 retainers. On the back side is the Byzantine cross with the crosspiece taken off. These are all from the British Museum. So they retain images of themselves. Since when is Islam allowed to have any images? That's anathema, is it not? When Abd al-Malik comes to power, he has a coin like this. That's a coin of himself with a large sword, and there's the Byzantine cross, or half the Byzantine cross. He then throws that out, and in 691 introduces these coins. He takes off the images and introduces script. And what do you think's on that script? The Shahada. This is the first time we see the Shahada. This is the first time anywhere that the Shahada is introduced, in 691. Are you getting me? Are you following me? That's not all he does. He then builds the greatest structure of its day, the Dome of the Rock, built there in Jerusalem. But take a look at where it's built. It's not just built anywhere. Who controlled Jerusalem, and who's the great power that he's up against? The Byzantines. He's up against the Byzantines. He doesn't care about the Sassanids because they are pretty much destroyed and they don't have a common ancestry. But he does have a common ancestry with the Byzantines because they have the prophetic line. So what are you going to do? You're going to build the greatest structure in the history of mankind, slap it right there in Jerusalem, but you're going to put it up on a hill above the Church of the Sepulchre, which is the centerpiece for the Byzantines. There you can see the Church of the Sepulchre across the valley and the Dome of the Rock. It's built above it to get one-upmanship. Are you getting that? And then he faces the Dome of the Rock towards Petra. Where's the sanctuary? So now you've got the biggest building, the best building, but to understand what's going on, you want something that's larger and more prominent than the Byzantines, the holiest city for the Jews and the Christians. Therefore, why not build this in Damascus? Because he's building it where the Byzantines have their holy place. And he says, we have the next holy place. And this is where, of course, if we now ask any Muslim today, what happens there? They say, this is where Muhammad went in the middle of the night on the back of the wing holes called the Miraj that I introduced earlier, and that's where he went up to the seven heavens. If that's the reason why the Dome of the Rock was built, then why is there nothing written about it? Look at all the ambulatories. Go look at all the inscriptions on the inner ambulatories. That's the only original part of the buildings that exist today. The building has been destroyed and rebuilt 11 times. If you look at the original ambulatories, you will notice that there are inscriptions up there. Take a look at those inscriptions. There's nothing at all written about the Miraj. So what's written on them? Well, notice what's written on them. O people of the Scripture, do not exaggerate in your religion, nor utter not concerning Allah save the truth. The Messiah, Jesus, son of Mary, was only a messenger of Allah, and his word which he conveyed unto Mary, and a spirit from him. So believe in Allah and his messengers, and say not three. Cease. It is better for you. Allah is only one God. Far as it be removed from the transcendent majesty that he should have a son. Surah 4, Ayah 171. This is the first Quranic material we can find. The first Quranic material is introduced on the Dome of the Rock. That's Surah 4, Ayah 171. Who is it against? Jesus, the Trinity, his sonship. It's against us. Praise be to God, who hath not taken unto himself a son, that's against Jesus, and who hath no partner, that's against Jesus being the partner of God, Surah 17, Ayah 111, and then Surah 112, there is no God but God. There's the Shahada, there's the beginning of the Shahada. There is no God but God. He is one, he has no associates, that's against Jesus Christ. Say, he is God the one, God the eternal begotten, besought of all. He begetteth not, nor was begotten, that's against Jesus Christ again, and there is none comparable unto him. Muhammad is the messenger of God. That's the first time Muhammad's name is introduced. That's the first place we find Muhammad's name. And it's introduced on the Dome of the Rock. And it's introduced on the coins the same year. Are you following what's going on? So they attack Jesus, and they introduce Muhammad. He then replaces Jesus on the Dome of the Rock. Now, at the same time, we have the protocols, the caliphal protocols. This is done by Yehuda Nevo. Yehuda Nevo noticed that all the protocols from the Sufyani period of the Umayyad Caliphate, from 661 all the way up until 680, up until 685, there is no Bismillah, there is no reference in any of these protocols. These are the official documents of the caliphs themselves. When you look at these official documents, there's no reference to Muhammad, there's no reference to Mecca, there's no reference to the Quran, and there's no reference to people called Muslims, and there's no reference to a religion called Islam. Those are the 5 things that these caliphal protocols should be replete with. They don't exist on any of the protocols until 691. In 691, Dr. Neville says, overnight they are introduced into the protocols. It's done overnight, and Muhammad's name is introduced at that time. The Shahada is introduced at that time. So here you have it being introduced on a building, on coins, and on the caliphal protocols, all in 691. He replaces all the images and replaces it with Arabic script. So once he introduces Muhammad, he then needs a revelation, because every prophet has to have a revelation. That's why now, and we're going to do work on this more tomorrow, so I'm not going to unpack it much today. When you look at the earliest manuscripts, they only begin to get introduced at this period. The earliest material that we have on the palimpsest that I'll introduce tomorrow are from the time of Abdul Malik. But then they get changed by the time his son comes around in 705. The earliest Quranic manuscripts begin to appear during the reign of his son Al-Walid from 690s to 750s. None of these manuscripts that we're going to see tomorrow are complete, nor do they even parallel each other, nor do they parallel the Quran that we have today. They continue to be changed and corrected for 200 years. Therefore, the sanctuary in Petra is destroyed by an earthquake in 713. Once the earthquake comes and destroys Petra, that means God's presence is no longer there. So the Umayyads have no other choice but then to move the sanctuary down to Mecca. That's why then from that time on, they decide, and this is where the rivalry goes on. When are they going to actually move it up to Mecca, went down to Mecca, and that's where the rivalry begins. And that's why the Abbasids start coming to the fore. And it's the Abbasids then that start changing the Qiblas starting in 731. So, here you go. Now that the Muslims have a prophet, who now has a revelation, who now has a sanctuary, Mecca, they need a history. So what do? Can you now understand why the Siddha takes so long to get written? Why it only is introduced, not in 765 by 765 by by Ishaq. Interestingly, we don't have Ibn Ishaq's material. It's all been destroyed. Which stands to reason. Looks like they destroyed everything that did not agree with the canonized text. And that's why finally Ibn Hisham writes it down. But Ibn Hisham makes it very clear that he threw out anything that he disagreed with at Ibn Ishaq. And he finally finalizes it in 833. So it takes him to 833 to finally write down the story of this prophet that was introduced in 691. It takes them another 40 years to then introduce his sayings. Can you then understand why he was given 600,000 and he whittles them down only to 7,397? He throws out 98%. Can you understand why he had to do that? Because that's where the censoring comes in. And that's why it makes sense now that this does not happen over a 22-year period like Muslims would like to tell us. What's happened to my PowerPoint here? So they now have a history. The Siddha is introduced in 833. The Hadith is introduced in 870. And the Tafsir, then the commentaries on how to understand the Quran, is introduced in 923, the 10th century. By the 9th century, they now have a book, the man, the place, and the story. And a new religion is formed and growing, yet not within a mere 22 years, but evolving over 200 to 300 years. How am I doing on time? I'm just concluding here. New books are being published which question the classical account of Islam's beginning. Questions we're asking is, why are the Muslim sources no Muslim sources for 200 years? Why do the claims they make not fit the historical record? Why are the geographical references so few and confusing? Why do they all seem to be much further north? Why are there so many references to vegetation which wouldn't exist in Mecca? Why is Mecca not mentioned until 741 and not included any map until 900? Why is Mecca not even on the international trade route? Why do all the Qiblas face Petra for the first 100 years, then are confused for the next 100, and aren't standardized to Mecca until 822? 822, that's 200 years too late. Why is Abdul Malik's role what is Abdul Malik's role in all of this? Does a nascent Islam really begin with him? Since much of what we know about early Islam is in doubt, since much of the Quran is also in doubt, since nothing is known to Muhammad until the 7th century, or Mecca until the 8th century, or his story until the 9th century, hundreds of years and hundreds of miles away, can we conclude that Islam is nothing more than a later redaction, possibly, I would say, begun by Abdul Malik, but I want to change that. I would also say that there is a political competition going on between the Umayyads and the Abbasids. And that's why Petra was finally discarded and Mecca was then included. But by that time, the Quran had already been written. That's why they couldn't excise all these geographical locations. That's why they couldn't take out all these references to Ad, Thamud, and Midian. They weren't able to do that. Can you see why? They should have done that in the 7th century before they even started writing the Quran. Too late. We've caught them hanging. And that's why it's so difficult to support Mecca. Can you now understand? They have the wrong man at the wrong place doing the wrong thing at the wrong time. Now what about Jesus? We know where Jesus was born in Bethlehem. We know where Jesus grew up in Nazareth. We know where Jesus died and went in Jerusalem. We know what Jesus did for the last 3 years. We know that from the eyewitness accounts, according to Matthew and John. We know from hostile accounts, Thallus, Tacitus, Josephus. We know when they were written down between 50 to 60 years. Few people doubt his historicity. Thus, we have the right man at the right place doing the right thing at the right time. Ooh, I love Jesus. And can you see why I love the Bible? Can you imagine if we had the problems that Islam has? How would we even debate what he did and what he said? With this kind of material now coming to the fore, and this has just been out just 1 month. Can you see, from here on out, we're just going to be asking these same questions. And that's why I love history, because the more they scratch, the more they find. The more they find, the more we shine. The more we shine, the more they whine, oh, how sublime. Thank God we don't have this problem. See, everything that I've said today, all this material that we're now using against Mecca and against the Qibla and looking at all the problems between the Umayyads and the Abbasids, have you noticed? This has all been foisted against Christianity. We've had it since the 1800s, and we had the documentary hypothesis. We had enormous amount of criticisms, of redacted criticism, source criticism. We've had all kinds of criticism against the Trinity and the person of Jesus Christ. We've had it for about 150 years, and we've answered every one of them. One of the best men I know, Sam Shamoun, can answer everything about Jesus Christ. But then we have not taken these questions to Islam. We are just now starting to focus these kind of questions. Redacted criticism. What have I done today? I've just been doing source criticism, redacted criticism. I've been doing historical criticism, a little bit of literary criticism. It's not very difficult to do what we're doing here. Every one of you can do this. We're now doing it in London. This is all going up on YouTube. It's starting to really hurt the Muslims. They don't have an answer for it. See, when this was brought out in Tübingen there with Wellhausen back in the 1800s, it decimated the church by 1905. By 1905 in Europe, all the churches were destroyed, most of the churches, not all, because of Darwinianism and because of historical criticism. Now, we've learned to find all these material. That's why we have a great museum tour called the British Museum Tour in the British Library. If you come to London, we're going to take you on it. In 3 hours, we will show you artifact after artifact stolen by the British, put into that building so we could look at it, that shows you exactly how 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, 1st and 2nd Samuel can be historically proven. We have names, dates, places, and people all right there in front of you to show and support the book of Genesis, the book of Jeremiah, the book of Isaiah. It's so good to be able to say that, because we've done our homework. Where are the Muslims going to go to find these kind of objects? Where are the artifacts to support Mecca, when they can't even find any ruins below those skyscrapers? Those skyscrapers are digging up nothing but sand. And that's exactly what Islam is built on. Nothing but sand. Thank God we're built on a rock. And that's why the rocks, if we don't cry, the rocks are going to cry out for us. And that's why we just need to fall back in the safety of our Lord Jesus Christ and know that He is putting the rocks in place and putting the tablets and the murals and the stelas so we can support what we know. And that's why I love my Bible. And that's why I love Jesus Christ. Good. Any questions you may have? Yeah. Is this being recorded, by the way? Is this being recorded? It's being filmed? Do you want me? Okay, he'll use a microphone.
Thank you for the information. It was great, and appreciate you sharing that with us, and look forward to being able to use that. I did one question, though, was you mentioned the mosques that were built in 632 and various stages. What's the history behind those? What were they being built for? If Muhammad and the Quran hadn't come into place yet, the history behind all that, why were these mosques popping up?
Okay, good question. The question is, what are you going to do with Guangzhou, a mosque in 630? What are you going to do with the Medina, the two Qibla mosque, which is 624? What are you going to do with these mosques so early, is what you're getting at. Remember, what was Petra before the Muslims took over it? It was the Nabatean sanctuary. So these would all be Nabatean temples that had been taken over by the Muslims, who then made them into their own mosques. A mosque means a place where you bow down. That's what a mosque is. It's a masjid. It's a place to bow down. And therefore, it was created by these early ones. The ones before the Muslims took them over would have been temples to the Nabatean gods. And what's interesting, take a look at the Nabatean gods. Who is the primary Nabatean god? His name is Allah. That's a Nabatean god. Isn't that interesting? Allah has a wife, Alat, which is the feminine form of Allah. The other name for Alat is Aluza. Have you heard that name? Alat, Aluza, and Al-Manat. Take a look at the Quran, Surah 53, Ayah 19 and 20. These are the satanic verses. These are the three goddesses that are mentioned in the Quran itself. These are Nabatean goddesses. Now, I read in my Quran, in Surah 6, Ayah 101, that God cannot have a consort. Then what's He doing with Alat, His consort? Ooh, I love this. Makes my job a lot easier. which means this Allah, this supposed Nabatean God from which all these people are praying to, is a borrowed God, but they've got the wrong God. They should have never used Allah, because Allah is not only a pagan God, he is a polytheistic God. He has a wife named Allat and Al-Uzza, which proves to me he cannot be the God we're looking for. Therefore, what and who is Muhammad? And what you've noticed today, we're not only confronting the God of Islam, Allah, we're also confronting the man of the Islam, Muhammad. Because after everything you've heard today and what you're going to hear tomorrow, those who were at the debate yesterday, the ones who were here yesterday, did you hear what we did with the manuscripts? We've pretty well destroyed any notion that the Quran existed before the 8th century. And if the Quran it doesn't exist until the 8th century, then who in the world is Muhammad? And what's his purpose? And in one fell swoop, we're destroying Allah, Muhammad, and the Quran all at once. And without Allah, Muhammad, and the Quran, what is Islam? Ooh, I love it. And that's why these are good questions, but remember, it all fits to the historical record. And that's why the documentary evidence fits the archaeological evidence. Tomorrow we're going to see it also fits the manuscript evidence. It's all fitting to one piece. And that's why I would say these mosques were temples, which then became mosques, but they're all facing Petra, the Nabatean kingdom, where Allah comes from.
Didn't they find some Qurans that were actually too early?
Okay, the question is, did they find some Qurans that were actually too early? And this is called and we can talk more about it tomorrow, but this is what the folios, the Birmingham folios. The date on those folios, there's just 2 pages. They actually come from the Petropolitanus manuscript, which is in Paris, in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris. Those 2 folios were dated from 568 to 645, so it's a 77-year period because it's carbon dating, which is very inexact. If it's 568 to 645, you've got a real problem. Because when this was ballyhooed last July all over the internet, they didn't stop to think what they were saying. And many Muslims did not say anything. Did you notice? A lot of Muslims were quiet. Because how can you have 2 folios of a manuscript from Surah 18, 19, and 20 that are from 2 years before Muhammad was even born, and then existed 7 years before the Quran was even written? Ooh, you've got a problem. But that's not the only carbon datings that they've done. They're now dating also the Sana manuscript. And the dates they're getting that are 443 to 543. That's the 5th and 6th century. That's long before Muhammad was born, long before Islam began, and certainly long before the Quran was written. Ooh, I love this. So it looks like these are pre-Islamic, pre-Quranic texts. They are Quranic in that they are very similar to what we have in the Quran, but look at the stories that they include. Surah 18, 19, and 20 include the story of Dhul Qarnayn, who is Alexander the Great. They include also the 7 sleepers, and they also include the story of Moses, which does come from the Bible, but not the same stories we have in the Bible. These are apocryphal writings. These are sectarian writings. These we know well of because the Quran is full of them. And it's these writings that you find in these folios. Now, let me just say, however, be careful of carbon dating. I have a feeling that most of these dates are wrong because they're all over the place. The fact that they're so early and that they are not consistent. I would suggest that as more time is being put into them, they're probably going to find that these carbon datings are not correct. And therefore, I would go with the paleographical and the codicological discoveries. Those are much more exact. We'll talk more about those tomorrow because the paleographical studies that are being done on the Quran are much more exact. And that's why we're going to go with those dates. Nonetheless, either way, Muslims have it wrong, because this means the Quran existed long before Muhammad. Muhammad had nothing to do with it. And the paleographical studies say the Quran existed long after Muhammad. Muhammad had nothing to do with it. So either way, Muhammad had nothing to do with it.